I should preface by saying that my main research area is Chinese Buddhism. And it's a subject only peripheral to my paper for this conference. And when I was thinking about these introductory remarks, I thought about, Chinese Buddhist scholars perhaps echoing the long-standing peripheral role of Buddhism in Chinese history are not normally counted on to comment on the Confucian tradition and Chinese culture, except in conjunction with largely Buddhist themes. So I count it as an honor to be so included. But on the other hand, taking my lead from Jacques Guernet, the French scholar of Chinese Buddhism, who also had a reputation for his views on the greater Chinese tradition, I've ventured into this larger arena. My paper takes its theme from the idea of Tianxia, which of course pertains to this conference. In the description for this conference, it was noted that one of the most important lines of critique that emerged from the two previous conferences with respect to Zhao Tingyang's Tianxia theory was that his Tianxia system was self-consciously a purely rational endeavor that lacked a vision for its practical implementation in the real world. With this critique in mind, this conference set as its primary objective the search for possible practical and ethical dimensions that can build upon Zhao's theoretical work on Tianxia. The fundamental premise here is that in order for the Tianxia system to remain relevant and significant in the world today, and in our vision for a global future, it must at once acknowledge the plurality of moral ideals defining the world's cultures, while at the same time seek practical ways to formulate a shared morality that can provide the limited solidarity needed to bring the world's people together. My paper is maybe a kind of in a roundabout way in an attempt to address this critique, to consider how the Tianxia system may remain relevant and significant in the world today and in our vision for a global future. I see the discussion of Tianxia as part of the contemporary revival of China framed by Confucianism, that is referred to as New Confucianism. This third iteration of Confucianism is contrasted with earlier iterations, classical Confucianism, and what we in the West refer to as Neo-Confucianism. Any Chinese Renaissance conceived in terms of its past is indebted to and must contend with its Wu heritage. I'm sorry, is that directed at me?
No,
anyway,
please go ahead, Professor.
In my paper, the third wave is compared with the second wave, Neo-Confucianism. The second reinvention of Confucianism is instructive, I believe, in assessing the prospects of the current reinvention. So I want to talk a little bit about the Neo-Confucianism, just in very general terms, but in the Song Dynasty and its impact. Following decades of warfare, over a century, if we include the decades leading to the decline and fall of the Tang Dynasty, and the successive regimes that were retrospectively honored as the five dynasties, but were actually a succession of warlords who failed to sustain their regimes. The so-called five dynasties occurred, if you recall, in a little over 50 years. So enough time for a warlord to come in, raise the banner of receiving the mandate of heaven, either being knocked off himself or his heir being knocked off soon after. So no sustainability. The early Song Dynasty rulers, Taizong and Taizong, were also warlords, gaining power through their military might. But upon attaining power, they broke with their predecessors and switch their perspective, advocating a regime determined by the values of one, or literary culture, as opposed to Wu, military prowess. The Song dynasty became defined by this new emphasis on literary culture, and the Song emperors set out to initially reconstitute it and endeavor to augment it as the signal feature of their regime. The success of the Song is such that it became one of China's great dynasties, providing the template for China for the next nearly 1,000 years. It was built on a commitment to one, literary culture, which in the early Song was very wide-ranging in scope, including the possibility of Buddhist and later on Taoist contributions, in addition to the efforts to retrieve Confucianism, which had been somewhat dormant as an intellectual force in the previous centuries when Buddhism tended to dominate. While this early phase of Song Shui, or Song learning, eventually gave way to greater and more exclusive focus on Confucianism, the influences of Buddhism and Taoism lurked in the background while at the same time influencing the foreground. Even a glancing comparison between classical Confucianism and Neo-Confucianism reveals the tremendous disjuncture between the two and the indebtedness to Buddhism and Taoism that it owes. To put it briefly, Buddhism supplied the questions to which Confucianism, aided by Taoist metaphysics, provided answers. The Buddhist agenda is apparent, for example, in the Neo-Confucian preoccupation with such things as mind, nature, Xing, and principle, Li. The Neo-Confucian form of meditation, Jingsuo, or quiet sitting as a technique for spiritual cultivation, is but a Confucian repurposing of Buddhist Zuochan, or sitting meditation. The entire Neo-Confucian metaphysic and psychology may be seen as a calculated response to Buddhism, aided by Taoist metaphysics. Zhou Duni, as many of you know, the pioneer of Neo-Confucianism, used Taoist metaphysics as a framework for his ethical philosophy, which was instrumental in providing a Neo-Confucian alternative to Buddhism. Neo-Confucianism thus provided both a revival of classical Confucian ethical and moral principles, updated to align with the social values of the Song dynasty, and a reaction to the challenges of Buddhist and Taoist philosophy and religion. Although Neo-Confucians denounced Buddhist metaphysics, it borrowed Buddhist terminology and concepts and relied on Taoist metaphysics to form its alternative model. My point, and I want to make this very clear, is not to brand Neo-Confucianism as imitative and unoriginal. Quite the contrary. I want to suggest that its success was predicated on the creative response it made to the challenges presented by the Buddhist agendas. Neo-Confucian success may ultimately be attributed to an ability to adapt core Confucian orientations and moral principles to unforeseen, unimagined agendas. This is the lesson from the past that the Wu legacy bears as Confucians confront the current situation and attempt to redeem their tradition in a third modern iteration. The path I've charted here is one of paradigmatic shifts in Confucian orientations. As outlined above, Confucian orientation went through a massive reorientation and reconfigurations from its original formulations as Ruism in the pre-Qin period, focusing on the quest to nourish human benevolence, Ren, through ritual protocols, or Li, to create a harmonious society based on moral virtue. To its reformulation as Neo-Confucianism in the Song and Ming dynasties, integrating Buddhism and Taoism in its metaphysical, psychological, and epistemological revolution. The model of keeping old bones intact while adopting a new skin serves as an apt metaphor for how the modern Confucian revival, New Confucianism, might prosper in an age of globalization by adapting, or may I say co-opting, the political and ethical values of human rights, democracy, and Republican form of government in a paradigm of creative transformation. The age of globalization suggests, among other things, that Confucianism no longer be parochial, reflecting the values of a particular region or country, but international, offering an attractive and viable model to the entire global community. Moving forward, new Confucian thinking must compete in the international marketplace of ideas and actively engage its audience to adopt an agenda that remedies the perceived failings of modernity, unbridled capitalism, unchecked individualism, environmental devastation, imbalances of wealth, racial and gender-based inequalities, and so on. The lesson from the past, stemming from the Ruism to Neo-Confucian transformation, suggests that Confucians must be receptive to creative, even radical re-envisioning of its perspectives. The richness of Neo-Confucian thinking, while inspired by works like the Analects and Mencius, expands far beyond the contours of the Ruism formulated in preaching China to embrace a new cosmological vision, rich in metaphysical theories and psychological insights, the quote-unquote new skin. The successful coupling of these to the original Confucian social and ethical model, the quote-unquote old bones, became the basis for the new paradigm. Rather than retreat to the past, new Confucians, I think, would be advised to not follow the maxim of Confucius and the Analects. I transmit, but do not innovate. I am faithful to and fond of the past, but to heed the advice in the Book of Rites, which says the innovators are regarded as sages, the transmitters as merely intelligent. The key to the success of the Tianxia model initiated in the Song period was a culture of one that encouraged inclusive engagements. This inclusion created the context within which a Chinese culture, one model, could progress, engage, and prosper, leading to a cultural renaissance. During the Song dynasty, this engagement involved conversation with and reaction to Buddhist influences. In contemporary China, this engagement involves conversation and reaction to the values of Western liberalism. In my view, the success of this third iteration of Confucianism hinges upon its ability to creatively reinvent itself through this discourse. Okay, that's all that I have to say. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. Very, very good. Thank you very much. Please have questions or comments.
If nobody else has a comment, I can comment or a question. Oh, there we go, Roger.
Yes.
Albert,
Yeah.
I think your recommendations are really consistent with the way in which we've seen this Confucian tradition evolve. Like, as you say, you know, you have the 100 schools, and then you have Confucianism as a state ideology. You have its transformation in Neo-Confucianism. I wonder if, two things. Number one, I wonder if we would talk about contemporary Confucianism as Xinruxue. Like, Xinruxue is a term that was invented in the 1980s to celebrate Confucian heroes, you know, like Qian Mu and Mo Zhongshan and Tang Juni, Confucian heroes who in their time used traditional Chinese culture as a bulwark against the disintegration of China as a culture. And so even though today people sort of posture as 新儒学家, third generation, fourth generation, this kind of stuff, I think maybe we would do well to follow your suggestion and really see Confucianism today as something like 国际儒学 or 世界儒学, to have a new name for this this evolving Confucianism. But I have a great inspired by the interface between Buddhism and Neo-Confucianism, how can we but not celebrate the possibilities of a hybridic Confucianism becoming a resource for a changing world culture? And so the idea that we need a progressive, we need an evolutionary, we need a Confucianism that will embrace the issues that we face today, gender discrimination, race, all of these contemporary issues. But my own, I'm encouraged that that's the direction that Rushui is going.
Mhm. Well, thank you, Roger, for your comments. I really appreciate your perspective, and I agree with you. And I wanted to say, and I think I mentioned in my paper, I realize that this is, that this process is going on, right? It's not as if, I'm trying to suggest, oh, well, turn attention to this. This is just kind of going on very naturally. But I thought it might be useful, and that's why I addressed in this paper, that people become a little more conscious of the context, and by looking at the Tong Song transition and the revival and reinvention of Neo-Confucianism in that time, I think it gives us a template of sorts. I mean, we can't just repeat Neo-Confucianism, and I know that there are some people who try to do that, in a sense, trying to update Neo-Confucianism, but it's going to take more than that, as you say. And I like your idea of, rather than calling it Shinrushui, but Shijia Rushui or Rushui or something like that, that would really kind of change the direction and chart the course of where it really needs to go. Because what I see is, that a lot of the discussion, it's like it's among the choir, so to speak, and it hasn't found a very successful way of really penetrating and reaching out to people that I think we want to kind of influence, and to get them, I hate to say it, get them excited about this, that we need to, I think it was James Hankins earlier talked about the kind of a renaissance. And I think that's what, that should become, you should maybe work on providing the basis for this kind of renaissance. Let's face it, I think we all agree the world desperately needs it. And what it looks like, I'm not, what it might look like, there are better minds than mine to try to figure that out. And of course, it's something that will be done collectively over time, as I point out in my paper. Neo-Confucianism did not just occur overnight. It was a long process. It was a long process. Jushi, we talk about the Song Dynasty as if it represents Jushi orthodoxy. Jushi lived at the end of the Song Dynasty. His orthodoxy wasn't established until the Yuan, and especially in the Ming Dynasty. The Song Dynasty was much, much, much more fluid, and was this kind of almost crucible of kind of cultural ideas and interactions that were taking place that led to the kind of consensus that eventually came. And I guess that's the lesson that I also want to see when I look back at the Tong Song transition, how this took place over not just several decades, but really a couple of centuries of work.
Very good.
Thank you.
张峰老师，张峰。
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for a very interesting paper. And I find the argument about the Tianxia with liberal democratic characteristics very thought-provoking. I have a couple of interrelated questions. I think what you've done is really to have raised a very big question, and this is a question that we scholars, intellectuals inside mainland China have been grappling with since the turn of the 20th century, and namely a new synthesis in thought and practice for a new China in the modern world. And I think your argument can be interpreted within this broad framework. So do you think that this project, Tianxia with liberal democratic characteristics, perhaps have already begun by the new Confucians in Hong Kong and Taiwan? And would you consider today's Taiwan as some kind of interim product or near product of such a synthesis? That's one. And second, I think you very rightly pointed out that this process, if it's going to occur, is going to be a very lengthy one. You pointed out the Neo-Confucian consensus synthesis took place centuries over through the Song and Ming dynasties. So it's not an overnight thing. And here at the moment, we can certainly think of lots of obstacles for synthesis between Chinese traditions, mainly Confucianism, and Western liberal democracy. And I think it's fair to say the prevailing view here in mainland China now is that somehow Western liberal democracies are failing in various aspects, especially domestic governance, but also their foreign policy. So I don't think a lot of people are taking liberal democracies as a worthy model to emulate, at least not at this moment. So it's going to be a process, and this process won't hinge solely on China's own efforts. If liberal democracy is going to provide a worthy model, liberal democracies must work hard. Western countries must work hard too. So that's the second part. And the third point is that I think when the synthesis, when Neo-Confucianism culminated in the Song and Ming period, Buddhism was already a widely popular religion among the population. It's deeply popular. I think within the populace. But if we use this and that, if we think of liberal democratic ideas, especially in terms of their popularity and acceptance in the Chinese society, especially in mainland China, it's far from that. And so here is a big difference. And I suppose it supports your qualification that this is going to take a long time. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for those illuminating comments. I want to start with the last one first about liberal democracy. I guess maybe the title suggests that I'm thinking of Tianxia with liberal democratic characteristics, and so that's maybe a little bit misleading. Because if you look at what happened in the Neo-Confucian example, it was they reinvented, the response was a reinvention, so that it wasn't like, I suppose you could say it was Neo-Confucian, Confucianism with Buddhist characteristics, but that's not really accurate, right? It was a reimagining of some of the questions that Buddhism posed in a kind of and the responses were incorporated in the new Confucian model. So what I guess I would say is that it's really the influences of the kind of the questions of the world that liberal democracy has created, and one we might agree has led us to a somewhat problematic place. But in order to get over that, overcome that problematic place, we need to provide answers where liberal democracy is failing. And in those answers is a kind of acknowledgement of the influence of liberal democracy without advocating it, if you understand what I'm trying to say. So that and what this looks like, I have no idea. I mean, that's beyond my purview. But I do think it's not about kind of merging together Confucianism and liberal democracy. It's Confucianism, as they did in the case of Buddhism, coming up with a creative response that is unique and different, but satisfies some of the same quests and some same needs, if that makes sense. I hope it does. And if I can come back to the earlier point, if I remember it correctly, I'll just kind of reiterate that, I realize this process, it's been going on, as you say, since the, into the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. So it's already in process. There's no question about it. And so I think, and mainly aided, as you mentioned, by, through much of this period, through what was going on in discourses among Confucians outside of mainland China, such as Taiwan or Hong Kong and so on. And they played, I think, a very crucial role in kind of keeping the torch alive, so to speak, because for most of us, and even when I started out as a student, when Confucianism was introduced, it was kind of as a historical subject without much, if any, contemporary relevance, right? That's the way, we need to study it because it has an influence on the Chinese tradition, but it's no longer, it's no longer viable. It's not important in that kind of way. And, fortunately, we've moved way beyond that. And I think we owe a lot to the Confucian scholars, the interest, the people outside of mainland China who kept this tradition alive and viable and kept the discussion about it alive and viable while it was, it wasn't even on life support in mainland China, through many of those decades.
Professor Park?
Yes, thank you very much, Walter. Very, very interesting paper. And I think you touched upon this issue as you respond to all your questions, but more in your paper than your today's presentation summary. I felt that you repeatedly emphasized a cultural revival, right? How the Confucian culture was revived and so my question is, to put it simply, what is the relationship between this cultural revival to political dimension? So definitely when you talk about the liberal democracy and Confucianism, and even the historical kind of context, when culture is revived, right? We don't usually say political revival, right? So
Right.
What happens in this relationship between cultural revivalism or kind of igniting the culture again? And then what would be its kind of actual dimension in political realm?
I think great question. I mean, personally, I think that if it's going to succeed, it needs to be a cultural revival and not kind of a politically directed. It has to seep down into the hearts and minds, so to speak, of people in society, and they need to become enthusiastic about it, and not something that they are instructed to do from above, from on high. And so if it's going to succeed, it needs to become a cultural revival, really what I say, a cultural renaissance. It needs to excite people, about the possibility about the prospects, right? It can't just be a kind of defensive apology and kind of a reaction. It can't just be reactionary. It has to go beyond that. How it does that is, again, that's beyond my purview. But that's what I see. One of the things, though, that I saw that in the early Song Dynasty, especially initially in the first decades, they really encouraged all kinds of literary projects. We have the four great books of the Song, recollecting kind of resources of all time, of all kinds. We've got and these are imperially sponsored projects, very much so. And then we've got like recovery of Buddhist resources. The Buddhist canon gets printed at that time. The Taoist canon gets printed, a couple decades after that. So this is part of this is a cultural renaissance based on the incorporation of a vast collection of literatures, not just Confucian literatures. And it's interesting, though, even from the very beginning, we have like a lot of diverse perspectives. I mean, we've got some Confucians, who are, they're following Hanyu in the late Tang. They're virulently anti-Buddhist. On the other end of the spectrum, we've got literati who are, championing Buddhism as the kind of the signature kind of literature for the Song Dynasty. And we've got kind of a series of flavors in between, which is what I tried to represent in the chart in my paper.